in the 1700s, showing that really there have always been some people who develop obesity. Now, there's actually considerable evidence that the reason that some people are susceptible to obesity is because of genetic factors. If we take any two people in the room, 40 to 70% of the variation in their weight is due to variation in their genes. And we know that because when we study twins, shown here, identical twins have a very similar body weight and body size and body shape, whereas non-identical twins or siblings can be quite different. When we look at heritability estimates, even in the modern environment, if you look at twins, for example, who are children, again, they are much more likely to share a body weight genetic factors than to the environmental factors that they share. Now, there is very good evidence that genes can affect many different things. They can affect how much you eat, how full you feel, your metabolic rate, and also how many calories you lose with a given amount of exercise. Genes can also influence why people respond to bariatric surgery and why some people don't respond. Now, how do we know what those genes are? Well, actually, the very first discoveries came by studying mice. So as you can see here, the Obi mice were found in 1994 to be lacking a hormone leptin. Now, this hormone was shown by Jeffrey Friedman and the Rockefeller in New York to be coming from the fat, circulates in the bloodstream, and then acts in the brain to regulate appetite and weight. And this discovery in mice really paved the way for understanding a whole physiological system that regulates weight, whereby the brain and specifically the hypothalamus receives signals from our fat telling us how much energy we have stored, and signals from our gut, both neural signals and hormonal signals telling us that we've eaten a meal. And these signals are combined to regulate appetite and weight over long periods of time. Now, we were able to show that this system is important in people, not just in mice, by the study of children with very severe obesity. These are two of my patients. You can see them here. This is a 1-year-old weighing 20 kilos and a 3-year-old weighing 36 kilos. So very severe obesity. These children were developmentally otherwise normal, and we found that they were completely lacking the hormone leptin and had a homozygous mutation in the gene that encodes leptin. And as a result, these were the human equivalent of those mice, and this was proof that leptin is required to regulate weight. So we then started a clinical trial giving these children back injections of leptin, and you can see that after 12 months, with very dramatic effects, where these children are now entirely normal. And this disorder of leptin deficiency is very rare, but we treat children from around the world with leptin therapy now. And what we learned is what is happening downstream of leptin in the brain. When leptin reaches the brain, it acts on a receptor which is expressed on neurons in the hypothalamus. And there are some neurons that tell you to stop eating after a meal and other neurons that tell you to eat. Now, those signals are then combined at the next level of neurons, and a key control point is this melanocortin-4 receptor, or MC4R. And if you stimulate this receptor, you get a signal telling you to stop eating. Now, what we showed is that there are many patients who have genetic mutations that affect this part of the pathway that normally tells you to stop eating. And so if that is not working, they will continue to eat, often be very hungry, and gain a lot of weight. We also learned that this pathway can not just affect how much you want to eat, but also how much you like food. Okay? Now, what we observed in the children who were lacking leptin is that they really like food all the time. In fact, they behave as if they're starving. They want to have food. Any kind of food is appetizing for them. So we wanted to study how that may be working, and we used functional MRI, where the children are lying in the scanner. We can image the brain, but as well, if they're looking at certain images, we can see which parts of the brain light up or are activated by certain images. And what we see is in the leptin deficient state, when they're very hungry, always want to eat food, any picture of food will cause the brain response to be activated. And it's particularly areas of the brain called the nucleus accumbens or other areas involved in reward. When we treat them with leptin, just after 7 days, this pattern in the brain goes down. Now, what we see is a change in their behavior. Before treatment, they really like pictures of cake, but they also really like pictures of cauliflower, which is quite an abnormal response, at least for many children. And then when we treat them with 7 days of leptin, they quite like the cake, but now they rate the cauliflower as 0 out of 10. So their behavior has changed in a very short time because of leptin. And what that shows us is that leptin affects a very sophisticated behavior, is how much you like food. And I think this is something we recognize is prevalent in all people, because if you are starving or even fasting, for example, your leptin levels will fall, and that will trigger you to feel hungry. And if you feel hungry, that response is picked up and recorded in the brain. And this is something that's relevant, as I mentioned, in all of physiology. When we bring in healthy volunteers and we starve them, what we find is that leptin levels fall to 20% of baseline, but then when we allow them to eat freely, leptin levels go back up again. Okay? And what we find is that people, of course, overeat to compensate for the amount of food that we have been restricting. But if you keep on allowing them free time, people will keep on overeating. And that is a phenomenon that we know very well when we try to encourage people to lose weight, that they actually often regain the weight. And in fact, they gain more weight than when they started. And often as physicians, we kind of just tell people off and tell them to cut down what they're eating. But we have to understand this is the normal physiology. As you lose some weight, your leptin levels will fall. And as a result of that, you will try to put on weight to restore energy balance. So what we've been then looking at is what happens in the brain when leptin docks on the leptin receptor and triggers a response. And there are many different peptides that are released in the brain and ultimately causing the expression of POMC, which is a major regulator of appetite. And this is important because we are finding new genes all the time that are controlling this system. One particular gene called SRC1 causes obesity, but also very severe insulin resistance and fatty liver disease in very young patients because they have an accelerated form of the disease. And it affects the switching on of POMC and the firing of the POMC neurons. Now, the key control point that I mentioned was the melanocortin 4 receptor, and we find quite a lot of mutations in this gene. Now, this information is important for genetic testing. In the UK, we have a panel of genes that we can now test, and in many countries around the world, this is available. And this is important because this is now part of the clinical guidelines for assessing children, particularly with severe obesity. And this is important because I think people are often very quick to blame families for causing obesity when actually there is often a strong genetic component, particularly if obesity starts at a young age. This is also important because some new treatments are coming up now, which we can give to people if they have a genetic form of obesity. There is a drug called setmelanotide that's currently in clinical trials and really showing dramatic effects in patients who have disruption of MC4R or part of that pathway. Now, in more recent data, we've been trying to see if we can understand and find new genes that could lead us to new treatments. And one of the things we thought about is what about people who stay slim in an environment that is pushing many people to gain weight? So we were recruiting a large number of thin people in the UK who are healthy, don't have eating disorders, don't have other medical conditions, but can stay slim. And we now have this cohort, and interestingly, a large number of them have a family history of being thin. Some of you will know people like this who can eat what they like and they don't put on weight. And we're very keen to figure out why. So what we have done is some genetic studies in those people, and what we see is that we find many different common variants. Some are linked with obesity, some are linked with thinness, and some are linked with controlling weight. Now, if you add up many of these individual variance, you can make a risk score. And what we find is that risk score is higher in obese people than in normal weight people, but it's much lower in thin people. So the people who can eat what they like and don't put on weight have genetic reasons for that. They often have less of the genes that push people to gain weight, and they have specific genes that allow them to stay thin. And this is really important when we try to understand how come some people are protected from obesity. So some other new information we got on that was from a study here where we looked at UK Biobank. Now this is a cohort of 500,000 people in the UK who have volunteered for research and on whom we have the DNA and lots of clinical information. Now any researchers can apply to use this data, and it's proving very valuable to discover new things. So what we did was look at that melanocortin-4 receptor, the gene we are very interested in, and we found 61 different variants. And we decided to do is to study all of those variants in cells. And we studied the known pathway using G proteins, but we also studied the new pathway involving beta-arrestin. And what we found is that the genetic changes in this population all result in different effects on the receptor. So some of the receptors are not working, causing a loss of function. But interestingly, some of the receptors are working too much. They're overactive, a gain of function. Now, what we found was that the mutations that caused a loss of function were associated with obesity, which is what we expected based on our previous work. But there were gain of function variants that were associated with protection from obesity. And they were also associated with protection from type 2 diabetes. When we looked at all of the variants in cells and compared them to their effect on BMI, it was actually the new pathway, beta-arrestin, that was having the strongest effect on BMI for all of the variants. Now, this was important because when we look at the variants that were affecting beta-arrestin, the new pathway, people who carried those variants had a 50% reduced risk of obesity and type 2 diabetes. So these are otherwise healthy individuals who just have one genetic change, and as a result of that, have a 50% reduced risk, which is really remarkable. Now, we've then gone on to see why does this actually happen, and what we find is that the MC4 receptor is permanently switched on in people. Now, what normally happens is a receptor is on the surface of a cell, and after it is activated by the ligand or a hormone, it sends a signal, but after about 10 minutes, it switches off, which is an important mechanism to protect you from always being stimulated. Now, what we find is with this particular mutation shown in the brown, that actually the receptor is switched on, but actually it stays on and keeps on working. Now, the normal function of the receptor is to tell you to stop eating. So if you keep that signal going, you can imagine people keep getting the sensation that they are full, they don't need to eat anymore, and that would explain why they're protected from obesity and diabetes. And we can show that in cells, the receptor stays on the surface of the cell. It doesn't get sucked inside the cell to be switched off, and this is why the receptor keeps on working. And this is important because we can now are trying to develop some drugs that would do the same thing as the natural mutation. So the drugs would drive signaling through this beta-arrestin pathway. And if we can find drugs that do that, they are likely to be both safe and effective for weight loss. So I just want to really bring the conclusion to an end now and leave plenty of time for questions. I've shown you that we have found that genes can cause severe obesity when they are disrupted, and that most of those genes, there are about 15 of them now, act predominantly by affecting appetite. And this is quite new because in the past, people thought if there were genes, they would probably mostly affect metabolism, but in fact, it's genes that affect behavior and appetite that really have the major effect on our weight. This is important because clinical guidelines now recommend genetic testing, particularly when the obesity is severe and when it starts at a young age, before the age of 5. And I have actually had many referrals from colleagues in India with such children who we have diagnosed. This is important, as I said, for clinical guidelines, and genetic testing is now available. And it's also important because it should give us a more sympathetic attitude towards our patients. Sometimes patients are blamed because they have severe obesity, and families are blamed if their children are very heavy. Now, in populations where we've tended to think that children are heavy is a sign of being healthy, but in fact, this is a very severe obesity that can be life-threatening. And it's important because I think one of our jobs as physicians is, of course, not just to treat our patients and to help them, but to inform people in society, to educate people about a more informed and understanding view of the complex factors that permit the development of obesity. And this is important for our patients, for their families, and for reducing the stigma with obesity. Okay, so I really just want to finish by thanking you. I think the message is very much the same as we do for obesity: eat less and exercise more. But if we can understand more about the genes, we may be able to find some new ways to treat patients with severe obesity. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Sadaaf, for this wonderful presentation and an eye-opening into the genetic. We will open this house for any questions. Yes, Dr. George Korean.
Sorry. Two questions. My name is George Korean. If this is a genetic disorder, it should affect children and not adults. And we find that most of our patients who have type 2 diabetes are people who put on weight after they've grown up to be adults. But if it's a genetic disorder, shouldn't it affect children?
So you're absolutely right. Most people in obesity clinics or in diabetes clinics, of course, don't gain weight as children, they gain weight in later life. And that reflects the chronic exposure to food and to being less active. But that chronic exposure acts on a background of genetic susceptibility. Okay? And this is basically families that you will see where a lot of people gain weight in middle age. People are much more likely to become very heavy. Now, the children I showed you have the severe genetic problems. And you're right, and as I showed, if you have a severe genetic problem, it will present in childhood. But if you have genes that are not as severe but still influencing your weight, then it may only become apparent later in life, with the environment revealing the genetic susceptibility.
Second question I have is are there racial differences? Because in India, we're finding people who are very lean who have fatty liver. Yeah. And we've actually done a small study with a group of students, and we discovered that young people with a BMI of less than 18, who are both us, have actually a lot more fatty liver than people with a BMI of 20-21.
Yes, absolutely. So there are very important differences between ethnic groups, and it's well known, of course, that in the Indian subcontinent, there are many people who are thin by definitions that we often use for obesity, who have diabetes, fatty liver, metabolic complications. And actually, we don't really know specific genes that drive that, but there are very likely to be some. Now, what we do know that probably the mechanism underneath that is to do with how well your body can store excess fat. And so one of the major principles for why some people with a certain amount of weight develop diabetes is to do with how well you handle fat. And in fact, what we find is some of the people who are very heavy, who have a lot of fat, are actually the ones who don't get the diabetes and the other complications because their subcutaneous adipose tissue can expand to handle the extra fat. You're absolutely right. It's actually the people who aren't often that big, but their adipose tissue can't handle the fat. So then the lipid moves into the muscle and the liver, causing the complications.
Any other questions? Dr. Herb.
Thank you very much for your presentation. in your studies, as you have looked at how genetics plays a role in obesity and how certain genes are either mutated or turned on or turned off, have you also explored how epigenetics may be able to reverse some of these issues so that when a person makes some lifestyle changes, that those genes that were previously turned off now are turned on and vice versa?
So that's a very good question. We haven't looked at that, but of course lots of people are looking at that. And I think it's an important question because we know that from animal studies that epigenetic influences can affect weight. There's no clear evidence yet in humans, but then it's quite hard to prove that in people. But we know that the environment of the mother, for example, can affect the expression of genes in the offspring from animal studies. And it's quite likely that I think the environment of the mother will affect not only the risk of obesity of the child, but the risk of complications of the child. So I completely agree that environmental factors are likely through epigenetic effects to affect both weight and metabolic complications. At the moment, we don't have direct proof of that, but I know that many groups around the world are looking.
Large database that you've been able to access. Can you give us some idea as to the prevalence of some of these genes and how they're turned on, and the prevalence of them being turned on or off so that they affect obesity?
Yeah, sorry, I missed the beginning of the question. I think the prevalence. So for something like MC4R, which is the most prevalent, the variants that are protective are actually quite frequent in the population. They're present between 2 to 6% of the population have these protective variants. When it is the risk variants, that's probably about 0.5 to 1% of the population.
Thank you. And with that being, those prevalences being so low, yet our current obesity being so high and growing, so in certain countries we're already reaching close to 50% and soon are surpassing 50% in many more countries. How do you see genetics playing a role in this large population challenge that we are experiencing?
Yeah. So I think there's no doubt that the population challenge that we're experiencing is driven by environmental factors. Okay, but I think the issue with genes is that one single gene explains what I've just shown you. One gene can be, one variant can either protect against obesity in 4% of the population or increase obesity in 1%. That's small. But actually what is likely is there are thousands, actually, if not hundreds of thousands of genetic variants. So a very recent paper in April of this year by colleagues in the Broad showed that if you make a risk score for 2 million genetic variants, then you can predict who develops obesity. And this is very new work and it needs to be replicated in many populations. But I think that's what is really important is that's why each individual gene is probably having a small effect, but adding up many, many genes will explain more of the risk in the population. But the risk is then revealed by the environmental factors.
Any other questions?
This is a small question. Some people talk about the gut microbiome also influencing human genome. Are there any studies on the interaction of the human microbiome with these obesity genes, plus or minus?
So no studies as yet, but of course a lot of people are looking at the microbiome. Big changes in diet in a short time. So there's pretty good evidence that can change the microbiome. There's some evidence in animals mainly that changes in microbiome may affect gut nutrient absorption, possibly insulin sensitivity. I think I'm a little skeptical that it can affect weight over the long term. But I think that's kind of the next frontier, is trying to understand the level of these effects and how they work together.
Shahad, that was wonderful listening to you and understanding the genetic basis and the interaction of the genes and environment for this epidemic of obesity. We really appreciate for you to come online and share your work with us. Thank you.
Thank you.